Welcome to another great edition of Outside the Circle. Today we'll be continuing our character study on David. Last week we talked about one of David's greatest battles with his fight versus Goliath, but sadly it wasn't really happily ever after for David. He didn't just ride off into the sunset and never have any problems. In fact, sadly his problems truly began after he became the giant slayer. See, everyone heard the giant fall. And it was David that did it, not Saul. And people noticed that, especially Saul. So we're going to pick up in our story from where we did last week. David kills Goliath and Israel has victory. And God once again came through for Israel, even when they didn't focus on him. Again, kind of their whole thing, really, like we talked about week 1 with the judges. Israel was God's people. They'd fall away from God when they felt like they didn't need him because, hey, we're, living up the high life. And so, they'd fall away. And then God would bring deliverance when they cried out for him, usually in the form of a judge. And then they were God's people again. It was, again, a vicious cycle that just kept continuing over and over and over again to the point that they end up, asking for a king and getting Saul, like we've discussed. And yet the cycle kind of still continues with Saul. God gave them Saul like they asked for, but yet even then, Saul stopped paying attention to what God was doing and went into business for himself. And so the same large-scale cycle that you see with Israel kind of continues in Saul's own life of, he was a man that seemed to be in line with the Lord, gets a, new position as king, and, is very prosperous, wins many battles. Israel's thriving under him. And yet, he still walked away from God and kind of went into business for his own self. In fact, even just with last week, when he came face to face with Goliath, he forgets what God had already done. It kind of reminds me of Moses and when I say Moses, but when Moses led God's people out of Egypt and they make it to the Red Sea, and they quickly forget what God had brought them through. It's like God literally just created plagues in Egypt to get you out of there, and yet now you're at a Red Sea and you don't think he can do anything about it. And so it's like they just forgot what happened. And Saul's kind of the same way. It's like time after time after time after time, God delivered them in battle and gave them victory, but yet here he goes facing Goliath, and Goliath's his Red Sea. Like, oh, well, there's no way around this one. I'm out of luck, basically. And sadly, that's where Saul was. Again, Saul was no better than Israel, just in his own personal life instead of the larger scale. But what we see from David, though, is that David knew who God was and knew what God could do through him if he allowed himself to be used by God. So David takes down Goliath, and everyone just praises David for this. In fact, that's kind of where we pick up our story in 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 2. Saul kept David with him from that day on, talking about after he took down Goliath, and he did not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as much as himself. Then Jonathan removed the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his military tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of the fighting men, which pleased all the people and Saul's servants as well. As the troops were coming back, when David was returning from killing the Philistines, the women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, with shouts of joy, and with 3-stringed instruments. As they danced, the women sang, and I really want y'all to pay attention to this, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Verse 8, Saul was furious and resented the song. They credited tens of thousands to David, he complained, but they only credit me with thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom?" So Saul watched David jealously from that day on. So here we see in the aftermath of David and Goliath, a lot kind of takes place. The first thing we really see is that Jonathan actually binds himself to David with a covenant, which again is more than just like a pinky promise. I mean, it was a big deal to be in a covenant with someone. And so Saul is sitting here seeing his own son make a covenant to be loyal to David, And so Saul's already kind of has issues, sees this really can't help the situation. So Saul becomes very jealous of David early on. And again, it totally makes sense, especially the way people are carrying on about him. Again, they're saying like, oh yeah, Saul killed thousands, but David our boy, he killed tens of thousands, like very much making it sound like David outstaged him, And so it totally makes sense why Saul would feel this way. I mean, David just took down the giant that Saul or his men couldn't do. And then his son goes and devotes himself to David. I mean, we'd all be there, And as we see at the end, it says that Saul watched David jealously from that day forward. And we see what that leads to in the next little bit of our story. If we continue in verse 10 of chapter 18. The next day, an evil spirit sent from God came powerfully on Saul, and he began to rave inside the palace. David was playing the lyre as usual, but Saul was holding a spear, and he threw it, thinking, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David got away from him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. So to understand what we're discussing here, we actually kind of have to flip back to a spot that I kind of just moved over between young David and Goliath. There's a small little section that I kind of skipped over because I knew we would discuss it a lot more in depth this week, and it just didn't feel right to put it in one of the other weeks because it's just kind of a random side note. But if we go back to chapter 16, specifically verse 14, we actually get a picture of what it's talking about, because it says David's playing a lyre, and there's actually importance to that other than just randomly, it being a random moment that happens. So, starting in verse 14 of chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. Now the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and an evil spirit sent from the Lord began to torment him. So Saul's servants said to him, "You see that an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command your servants here in your presence to look for someone who knows how to play the lyre. Whenever the evil spirit from God comes on you, the person who can play the lyre, and you will feel better." So that's kind of intense. I mean, you start off by hearing where it says that the Lord began to torment Saul for his disobedience, which can kind of be a difficult thing to come to terms with. Not really going to dig too much into that. It's a great thing to look up in your own time, but just got to kind of keep moving. But basically this evil spirit comes upon Saul, and he decides to go out looking for a lyre player. Because during this time, lyres were basically believed to have supernatural abilities to an extent. Like, they had divine power, especially over demons. And so basically looking for someone to help ease his trouble from this evil spirit that is on him, you would look for someone who could play a lyre that could hopefully drive this demon and stuff away. So so one of Saul's men, in the next few verses, we see that one of Saul's men actually knew about David. He literally says, "Hey, there's a son of Jesse who knows how to play and play it well." And so Saul said, "Hey, go get them and bring them to me." And so they bring him to him, and that's actually where we'll pick back up with what happens next in verse 21. It says, "When David came to Saul and entered his service, Saul loved him very much." Catch that. Saul loved him very much. And David became his armor bearer. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor with me." Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would pick up his lyre and play, and Saul would then be relieved, feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. So even before David and Goliath, Saul knew David because David played for him and soothed his soul when the evil spirit came upon him. Honestly, we could kind of pick that apart because that is a lot of fun stuff to kind of talk about. But again, we just kind of keep going. But if we go back to chapter 18, where Saul is really coming after David's life here. And that's what's crazy is you go from 16 where it talks about that Saul loved David so much. And yet after Goliath, Saul was jealous of David, you know. And so this jealousy keeps growing, and it actually grows too much that he actually takes an attempt on David's life. Verse 12 of chapter 18 clearly tells us that Saul is afraid of David because the Lord was with David and actually left him, you know. Now, fortunately, this conflict gets resolved for the meantime to an extent. Again, it does say David eludes him, basically. And so David stays with Saul because he is still loyal to his king, even after these attempts at his life. And so after some time, Saul actually decides to betroth one of his daughters to David. So first he kind of betroths his oldest daughter, Merab, to be wed to David. But she had apparently already been given away to another that Saul seemed to not really know about. It's a little unclear. But basically, she was supposedly betrothed to someone else. So Saul kind of had to go to his next daughter, Michal. And so the beauty of this, though, is that Michal actually really loved David. And fortunately, David kind of fancied her. So Saul arranges for them to get married. But David quickly says, I have no way to pay the bride's price. You know, kind of the dowry, so to say. Especially for a king. You know, he's like, I was just a lonely shepherd boy. There's no way I can pay that. And so Saul's like, you know what? It's fine. You don't have to pay a price in money. But the Philistines that we had just sent on the run because we took down their champion, they're still out there. So Saul comes up with a solution for that by sending David out on this mission. And this would be the bride's price. And so he tells David to get rid of the Philistines there. And so really what he's actually trying to do is get rid of David by sending him on pretty much a suicide mission, is how he views it. So David gathers up some folks and he goes off to kill the Philistine army. And these men that he gathered together actually become known as David's mighty men later on. Basically, they were like an ancient days special ops type team of some of the best warriors in Israel. And so Saul says, you know what, hey, go out there with your men, and I want you to kill 100 Philistines and circumcise them and bring their foreskins to me. And that's actually where we'll pick up in verse 27 of chapter 18. It says, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented them as full payment to the king to become his son-in-law. Then Saul gave his daughter Michal to David as his wife. Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved him, and he became even more afraid of David. As a result, Saul was David's enemy from then on. Every time the Philistine commanders came out to fight, David was more successful than all of Saul's officers, so his name became well known. So through God, David actually went above and beyond what Saul required. Saul said, I want 100. David came back with 200. And so now from David's side of this thing, he just did a great deed. You know, he's like, I value my king so much that my king wants 100. I'll bring him 200, you know? And so he sees this as being faithful and loyal to his king and going above and beyond because of the fact that he feels like, oh, well, my king's being generous by letting me have one of his daughters. Let me repay that gratitude by giving him above and beyond what he asked. But that's not exactly how Saul sees it. Saul actually sees it as David just trying to outdo him. And now he's got Michal, so it's like, here you go from Saul. He's the king. Then, God rejects him. And so he's already dealing with that. It's unclear if he actually knows if David's the anointed one to replace him. It doesn't really say that he does at this point. So more than likely he didn't know that. So if he did, it probably would have even been worse. But basically, here you have Saul, very victorious in battle, stands before Goliath and is like, oh, well, we can't do this, until little old shepherd boy David comes along. David pulls it off. And so not only does he have this huge victory that the people are praising, like, oh, Saul's got his thousands, but David's got his tens of thousands. So you already got the jealousy growing there. Then his son makes a covenant with David. And so Jonathan and David become best friends basically from that day forward, almost like, really more so brothers than best friends. And so now your son's kind of on David's side and loves David more than you. So your people love David more. Your son seems to love David more. And now your daughter literally loves David and is now married to David. And so, Saul's just in a lot of bad stuff. And so this causes some serious jealousy, and the anger grows even more to the point of it says they become enemies. It's not even just, oh, I don't like him. It's, to Saul, they are enemies. But David never saw it that way. David, through all of this, never really realized how far Saul was going. He's about to find out, but for the longest time, it's like, oh, I'm just staying loyal to my king. I'm being grateful to my king. I love my king, and serving his king. And, but again, sadly, Saul's anger grows even more so, and he actually tries to kill David again. And David and even Jonathan step in to try to console the king, but to no avail. And so David actually goes on the run. And at first he actually ends up running to Samuel. And he actually stays for Samuel for a while until Saul finds out about this. And so when David finds out that Saul knows where he's at, that he's with Samuel, he actually leaves Samuel because he's trying to protect Samuel. And so he leaves him behind. And what's crazy is during this time of hiding, David actually finds a really interesting ally that actually comes from the kingdom himself, from the kingdom itself. So we'll pick up our story in 1 Samuel 19, verse 1. Saul ordered his son Jonathan and all of his servants to kill David. But Saul's son Jonathan liked David very much. So he told him, my father Saul intends to kill you. Be on your guard in the morning and hide in the secret place and stay there. I'll go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are and talk to him about you. When I see what he says, I'll tell you. So again, Jonathan, who made a covenant with David, would actually meet David in secret from time to time, trying to kind of help the situation, trying to kind of get David to where he can come back home, and hopefully Saul will stop with what he's doing. And honestly, even send warnings to David when things were getting too intense. And sadly, that's where Jonathan ends up having to do, is he sends a signal to David that things are not safe, and basically sends the signal to say, look, you need to flee, you need to go. My dad's gone crazy basically, and you need to leave. So David ends up fleeing, and when he flees again, he finds these priests, which is actually a really interesting encounter. Again, I'd really love to dig into this, but I do want to point out this two big details from his interaction with these priests, because they're both one of them's an interesting fact, one of them's actually going to be kind of important down the road. So while they're with these priests, they take him in and they help him out. And while they're helping him out, he needs food. And they're like, well, the only food we have here is some consecrated bread, which was only used for priests for certain occasions. But they ended up giving it to David. Which again is not like, it's not something that's super important for today's lesson, but it is going to be something we'll talk about later down the road, that this consecrated bread that was made for priests for special occasions was given to David. And so that's a really interesting part. Like I said, we'll get to later. So that's kind of the fun, I would say the fun one, but the neat one that's actually in here is while he's there, he actually grabs something from there. We see in here that he actually grabs the sword that he won from Goliath. So he gets Goliath's sword while he's there with these priests. And then he leaves these priests and he goes out and he ends up in Gath. Yes, that Gath where Goliath was from. And so the king there actually recognizes who he is and honestly wants to put him to death to an extent. But David actually thought on his feet and he decided to act crazy. And he would basically letting saliva run down his beard, and he was scribbling on the doors of the gate and things like that, like just acting like a madman. And it kind of sounds stupid up front, just really kind of weird. But there's actually, David was being a genius in this moment. Because see, back in the day, especially with the Philistines, they believed that anyone who was crazy like that this affliction came from the gods. And so basically they would just kind of leave these people alone, and it was basically deemed, in a way, it was kind of like bad luck if you killed one of these people, because again, they're afflictions from the gods, and so if you mess with that, then like basically, it could come on to you at that point. Was kind of the thought process. And so they wanted to get David, again, especially for Goliath, but with him acting that way, they're like, well, this man's crazy. I don't want whatever, he's got. So they basically just let him leave. So what looks like a really dumb and stupid moment from David and, acting like a fool basically, was actually David just outsmarting them, which is kind of cool. So David ends up leaving. And he actually takes refuge in the cave of Adullam, which again just kind of shows off how smart David is, because this area was on the other side of the Philistine territory. So for Saul to even find David, he would have to go through Philistine territory, which, as we see, Saul and the Philistines don't exactly vibe well, And so he would have to go through this Philistine territory to get to David on the other side of it, Now, with all this, though, we actually find out, and this will take us to chapter 22 of 1 Samuel. We actually find out David's not alone here. Starting in just reading verse 1. So David left Gath and took refuge in the cave of Adullam. When David's brothers and his father's whole family heard, they went down and joined him there. In addition, every man who is desperate, in debt, or discontented rallied around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. So David had developed kind of a following based on really just being loyal, not only to the king, but to God himself. David's character spoke for itself, and so people really rallied behind that. And of course, this obviously drove Saul even crazier in his pursuit to find David. And after some time, Saul actually gets really close to finding David. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 24, we see an exchange between these two. So Samuel ends up not realizing he found David, but basically is outside the cave where David's at. And so, again, 1 Samuel 24, verse 3. When Saul came to the sheep's pen along the road, a cave was there, and he went inside to relieve himself. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. So they said to him, "Look, this is the day that the Lord told you about. I will hand you over to your enemy, or hand your enemy over to you, so you can do to him whatever you desire." Then David got up and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "I swear before the Lord, I would never do such a thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. I will never lift my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed." Saul goes to the exact cave where David is at and doesn't even notice him. But David noticed Saul. And David had the perfect opportunity to kill Saul and to assume his rightful place as the next anointed king of Israel. But he didn't take the opportunity. And that's really important in understanding who David is. Honestly, David kind of gives us more insight with how he responds if we keep going on in verse 7. With these words, David persuaded his men, and he did not let them rise up against Saul. Then Saul left the cave and went on his way. After that, David got up, went out of the cave, and called to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David knelt low with his face to the ground and paid homage. David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of the people who say, 'Look, David intends to harm you'? You can see with your own eyes that the Lord handed you over to me today in the cave. Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you, and I said, I won't lift my hand against my Lord, since he is the Lord's anointed. Look, my father, look at the corner of your robe of your hand, of your robe in my hand, for I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. Recognize that I have committed no crime or rebellion. I haven't sinned against you, even though you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between me and you, and may the Lord take vengeance on you for me, but my hand will never be against you." So this man tried to kill David and had pursued him for gosh knows how long at this point, and yet David still didn't take the opportunity to kill him. See, even though the choice seems really simple, if David just kills Saul, then he becomes the next king of Israel. I mean, he is God's anointed. But David chose to stay faithful to God and God's timing. Because again, he could either kill Saul and become the new king, or he could just not kill him and stay on the run in this foreign land, basically. I mean, those were his two options. And yet he chose option B to say, you know what, this is still the Lord's anointed. God still has him in that place. Like, even though he knows he's the next anointed king, David still says, but God's got him there still. And he will not die by my hands. David waited on God even when it didn't make sense. He stayed patient, he stayed watching, and he just waited on the Lord's timing. And so Saul actually gets remorseful over this, and even praises David for not doing anything. And you kind of feel like, oh, hey, maybe there's a turning, maybe Saul's finally realizing like David's a great guy, and maybe you shouldn't hate him so much. That didn't last long. As a little bit of time passes, he ends up going right back to trying to kill David, and David flees again. And once again, we have a situation where David spares Saul's life. So again, it's a repeated pattern. Saul tries to kill David, David goes on the run, Saul gets right there with David, David spares Saul's life, and then, second verse, same as the first, right? And so this actually continues for a while. In fact, it continues for so long, we actually get to the point where Samuel sadly passes away. All of Israel mourns and weeps over this. Even Saul is actually kind of upset over this, and now God's prophet that he, gave to Israel after the judges kind of apparently weren't enough. Sadly, now he's out of the way. So now they're having to look to Saul as their sole source, of guidance and stuff. And obviously he's a mad king right now, so that's not exactly super great. Plus, as Saul, the creature of habit he likes to be, we actually see Saul once again at odds with the Philistines. The thorn in his side that just never seems to go away. And so that's actually where we'll pick up our story in 1 Samuel 28, starting in verse 5. When Saul saw the Philistine camp, he was afraid, and his heart pounded. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him in his dreams, or by the Urim, or by the prophets. Saul then said to his servants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I can go and consult her." His servants replied, "There is a woman at Endor who is a medium." So Saul goes out looking for a medium, since basically he felt like God wasn't answering, which, it kind of does just say, I inquired of the Lord, but he did not answer. So, God was apparently kind of being quiet to Saul at this moment. Again, understandable when we look at the fact that God rejected him. And so Paul went looking for this medium to give him answers. But he wasn't just trying to find a medium. He was actually trying to find someone specific, which is actually really interesting. And we find out who this is in verse 11. So Saul finds this medium. And so in verse 11, it actually says, the woman asked him, "Who is it that you want me to bring to you?" "Bring up Samuel for me," he answered. So after everything that's gone down, he was still looking for Samuel to give answers. I guess in his mind, if God wouldn't answer him, maybe God would answer Samuel, and then Samuel could give him the answer. That's how it worked for years. It's like, hey, you're the prophet. God speaks to you. If God's not willing to speak to me, maybe I can speak to you to get God to speak to me, basically, through you, in a sense. And what's crazy about this, like I just said, Samuel had passed away at this point. So he goes to the medium to be the bridge between worlds to find Samuel. This is actually where Scripture gives us a Force ghost. So for people like me who are Star Wars nerds, our Obi-Wan Kenobi Force Ghost shows up here, because Samuel is exactly who he gets in this moment. Look at verse 15. It says, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Samuel asked Saul. "I'm in serious trouble," replied Saul. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He doesn't answer me anymore, either through the prophets or in dreams. So I called on you to tell me what I should do." Samuel answered, "Since the Lord has turned away from you and has become your enemy, why are you asking me? The Lord has done exactly what he said through me. The Lord has torn the kingship out of your hands and given it to your neighbor David. You did not obey the Lord and did not carry out his burning anger against Amalekite. Therefore, reading that word weird. Therefore, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will also hand Israel over to the Philistines along with you. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, and the Lord will hand Israel's army over to the Philistines." So Saul got his answer from Samuel, and God at that and God to that extent, but it definitely was not the answer he was looking for. In fact, this answer terrified him so much. And sadly, if we skip ahead to chapter 23, we actually see what comes of this. So 1 Samuel 31, starting in verse 1. "The Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them and were killed on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons and killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua." I knew I was going to mess that one up. I've practiced it like 5 times, still can't figure it out. Anywho, verse 3. "When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers found him and severely wounded him. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me.' But his armor-bearer would not do it because he was terrified. Then Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So on this day, Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all of his men." And sadly, that brings to an end a very promising king in Israel, and sadly, even his bloodline was destroyed with the deaths of his son, including Jonathan at that, which is a terrible way to see Jonathan go. I mean, especially Jonathan being so faithful to David, to know that that's kind of how he meets his end it's pretty heartbreaking a little bit. Not gonna lie, but Saul was a king that once was on top of the world, because he was connected to God. And so, God gave him victory after victory after victory. And so to fall in such a tragic manner due to his own pride and arrogance is just, there's no other word than just to say tragic. I mean, it's honestly horrible, he was the dream king that Israel desired and wanted, and yet they got everything they wanted, and it very much became one of those situations of careful what you wish for, because you just might get it all. And sadly, that's exactly what happened to Israel. They wanted this strong warrior king, and that's exactly what they got. Which is kind of funny, because when they're looking for the Messiah, they look for the exact same thing. So, and now that I'm thinking about it, there's some parallels there. Sorry, you're seeing real-time connections made of Saul being the Messiah that Israel wanted, but David's more of the Messiah that they got, to an extent. That'd be a fun thing to do. Anywho, sorry, real-time thinking out loud. But back to our story. Now that Saul is out of the way, the door is actually open for David finally to become king of Israel. But what was David up to at this point? Last week kind of saw he was still kind of on the run. And he actually ends up in this area known as Ziklag. It's a fun word, Ziklag. And while he's there, he actually gets into conflict with the Amalekites that are there. Because they had raided this area over there. They had burned down Ziklag, which again is where David was kind of chilling. So obviously David's kind of dealing with it. So David actually, in the pursuit of these raiders that had destroyed this area, he actually meets with, he meets this Egyptian man who leads him to the raiders. And that's actually where we'll pick up our story. We got to go back to chapter 30 to see what's going on with David in verse 16. So he, the Egyptian, led him, and as far as David, and there were the Amalekites spread out over the entire area, eating, drinking, and celebrating because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines to the land of Judah. David slaughtered them from twilight until the evening of the next day. None of them escaped except 400 young men who got on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken. He also rescued his 2 wives. Nothing of theirs was missing from the youngest to the oldest, including the sons and daughters, and all the plunders that the Amalekites had taken. David got everything back. He took all the flock and herds, which were driven ahead, and the other livestock. And the people shouted, "This is David's plunder." So here in 30, David wins back all of his stuff, his wives, his children, from the Amalekites who had raided this area. And sadly, one chapter later in 30, Saul loses everything. Once again, God brings victory to David because David focused on him. But in chapter 31, sadly, we see Saul lost it all because he lost his connection with God by not staying loyal and focused on God. And so sadly, Saul was no more. And that's where we end the book of 1 Samuel, with an empty throne and an anointed king primed for the throne. So I know a lot was kind of thrown at you guys again today. Sadly, with a character study, especially a character with such rich history, there's just so much to cover, and there's so much I want to talk about. But, sadly, we only do have 7 weeks to really discuss it. So kind of having to nitpick and really highlight certain stories and kind of move through. Again, David's accounts in 1 Samuel, great one to read. Trying to hit some of the high points. And, of course, this story is going to continue in 2 Samuel, which is where we'll head next. So at the end of the day, I guess the real thing is, so like, what does all this really mean to us, especially after all that we've read today? Like, what does this really mean? And ultimately, I think what we see is two distinct pictures of two very different people. On one side, you have Saul. He was a strong and imposing man, and at first he was reluctant for the throne, but eventually it made him go mad. He pursued his own desires and his own ways and forgot that God put him there. He became the king in his life, and by becoming his own king, he forgot that God was ultimately supposed to be his king. And again, he was just the snapshot of what Israel had become. I mean, it really feels like God just used Samuel like, hey, you see how this guy's acting? Yeah, that's been y'all for generations at this point. Like that's almost what it feels like. I'm not saying that's what God did, but that's what it feels like almost. He became this prime example of it, of a cycle of falling away from God when things became too prosperous for them. See, Saul forgot that everything that he had came from God, that everything he was came from God, and decided to rely on himself, similar to what Israel did time and time again when they were in a very prosperous time. But David didn't. Through everything, David stayed focused on God. We see this with Goliath when he saw God and who God was more than he saw how big Goliath was. We see this when he's on the run and had every opportunity to kill Saul and take his throne. That he was, he was given by God. Like, Samuel anointed him as the next king. And so again, it's strike him down and you don't have to be on the run anymore. But David said, no, vengeance is the Lord's, basically. That God will sort you out. And I'll wait till he does. And so he waits on God's timing and dealing with that. And honestly, that's the real difference between Saul and David. See, Saul focused on himself and preserving his power without acknowledging that God placed him there. But David kept his eyes on God, both in the face of a giant and even in the wilderness. He always stayed focused on God through all of it. And that's where this week kind of ends. Again, an empty throne and a king ready for it. And a nation ready for a king who, will hopefully lead them back towards God. And we'll actually get into that next week, guys. So, see you later.